The darkness settled over the Ardennes forest like a burial shroud. December 1944. American soldiers huddled in foxholes, their breath forming clouds of white vapor in the frozen air. Some had not eaten in days, others had not slept in longer. The German offensive had come without warning, a wave of steel and fire crashing through the Allied lines with a ferocity not seen since the opening days of the war. Panzer columns advanced through the snowy woods, their tracks grinding over frozen earth, their cannons seeking American positions. For the men on the ground, it felt like the end, and then something changed. Something the Germans could not explain. Shells began exploding above their heads, in the open air, without striking anything. Shrapnel rained down from the sky itself, tearing through infantry, slicing into the thin top armor of tanks, killing men who had dug deep into the frozen earth. German officers screamed into their radios, demanding to know what new weapon the Americans possessed. There was no answer. There would be no answer for years to come. For what they faced that winter was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War, a technological miracle that had taken the best minds in America nearly 4 years to create. If you enjoy stories of forgotten weapons and secret history, please subscribe now and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the secret rocket shell begins not in a battlefield, but in a laboratory. In the summer of 1940, as German bombers pounded London and the fate of Western civilization hung by a thread, a group of American scientists received an impossible assignment. Create a shell that could think. Create a projectile that knew when it was close enough to its target to detonate without ever touching it. The concept sounded like science fiction. Every major nation had tried and failed. Germany concluded it was impossible. Japan made progress but too late to matter. Britain had developed promising prototypes but lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. And yet within 4 years, American factories would produce over 22 million of these devices, each one containing approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components, each one capable of transforming the nature of warfare itself. The man who made it possible was Merle Tuve, a physicist at the Carnegie Institution of Washington. In August 1940, Tuve took command of Section T, the secretive division of the National Defense Research Committee tasked with developing the proximity fuse. His team faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. The device had to contain a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, essentially a tiny radar set capable of detecting when a target was within lethal range. It had to fit inside a standard artillery shell in a space no larger than a pint milk bottle. It had to withstand the shock of being fired from a cannon, an acceleration force equal to 20,000 times the force of gravity. It had to survive spinning at 500 revolutions per second. It had to function in temperatures ranging from 100 degrees above zero to 50 degrees below. And it had to be manufactured by the millions using components from hundreds of factories across America. Tuve was not a man given to despair. He posted signs throughout his laboratory that read, "I do not want any fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another read, "The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late." His urgency was born from understanding what was at stake. In the Pacific, Japanese aircraft were devastating American ships. Existing anti-aircraft artillery was practically useless. Studies showed that gunners might achieve one direct hit for every 1,200 shells fired. Sailors defending against aerial attack were essentially gambling with their lives, hoping luck would see them through. Tuve intended to change those odds forever. The breakthrough came through a combination of innovations that reads like a catalog of American ingenuity. James Van Allen, the physicist who would later discover the radiation belts surrounding Earth, spent nearly a year developing miniature vacuum tubes tough enough to survive being shot from a cannon. National Carbon Company created a revolutionary wet cell battery shaped like a fountain pen, with the electrolyte fluid sealed in a glass ampule. When the shell was fired, the shock of the muzzle blast would break the glass, releasing the fluid and activating the battery. The centrifugal force of the spinning projectile would then distribute the electrolyte across the carbon and zinc plates, generating the electrical current needed to power the fuse. It was elegant, it was ingenious, and in the summer of 1942 it was finally ready to be tested. On August 12, 1942, the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland entered the Chesapeake Bay for a scheduled two-day evaluation. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. The Navy had allocated extensive ammunition for what was expected to be a difficult test. They did not need it. Gunners brought down all 3 drones on the first day with just 4 bursts of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, despite the operators conducting evasive maneuvers. The Navy immediately canceled the remainder of the test and began mass production. By late 1943, factories were assembling 40,000 units per day. By the end of the war, that number had reached 70,000 daily. The weapon that emerged from this program was designated the Variable Time Fuse, or VT fuse, a deliberately vague name chosen to conceal its true nature. The physics behind it were relatively simple in concept. A miniature transmitter inside the shell continuously broadcast a radio signal. When that signal bounced off a nearby target, a receiver detected the return. As the shell approached closer, the reflected signal grew stronger. When it exceeded a predetermined threshold, a thyrotron trigger released an electrical charge that detonated the main explosive. The shell did not need to hit anything, it just needed to get close enough. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, when 4 Japanese dive bombers attacked a Navy task force off Guadalcanal. As the aircraft departed after their attack run, anti-aircraft gunners aboard the cruiser USS Helena fired 2 salvos of proximity-fused shells. Without scoring a direct hit, they brought down one of the bombers. It marked the first time in history that an enemy aircraft had been deliberately destroyed by a near miss. The implications were revolutionary. By the end of that year, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval gunfire, despite only 25% of shells fired being fitted with the new fuse. The Allies guarded the secret with extreme care. For nearly 2 years, the proximity fuse was restricted exclusively to naval forces, deployed only over water where unexploded shells could not be recovered by the enemy. German and Japanese forces knew something had changed. They could see their aircraft falling from the sky in unprecedented numbers. They could not understand why. Captured pilots described American anti-aircraft fire as uncannily accurate. Intelligence officers puzzled over reports of explosions that seemed to occur in mid-air without striking anything. The truth remained hidden. This secrecy would have profound consequences for the ground war in Europe. While the proximity fuse transformed naval anti-aircraft defense, American soldiers fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of Germany had to make do with conventional artillery. That began to change in the summer of 1944, when Germany unleashed a new terror weapon against England. The V-1 flying bomb, a pilotless jet-propelled missile, began raining down on London in June. Traveling at nearly 400 miles per hour, too fast for most fighter aircraft to intercept, the buzz bombs killed thousands of civilians and seemed nearly impossible to stop. Section T responded with characteristic speed. Engineers modified proximity fuses specifically calibrated to target the small, fast-flying bombs. The special fuses were installed in British 3.7-inch anti-aircraft ammunition and American 90mm shells. In mid-July, the Allies rushed approximately 500 guns fitted with the new ammunition to installations along the English Channel. The results were stunning. In the first week, Coastal batteries destroyed 24% of all V-1s engaged. By the second week, that figure rose to 46%. By the third week, 67%. In the final week of the campaign, the batteries were destroying 79% of incoming flying bombs. On the last day of large-scale V-1 attacks, 104 missiles were detected by early warning radar. Only 4 reached London. But it was in ground combat that the proximity fuse would achieve its most devastating effects. Before we continue with this extraordinary story of technological triumph and tactical revolution, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter in our exploration of military history. The events that followed would reshape our understanding of what artillery could accomplish. The breakthrough came during the darkest days of the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive on the Western Front. 3 German armies, including 10 armored divisions, smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. The attack caught Allied commanders completely by surprise. Within days, German Panzer columns had advanced deep into Allied territory, threatening to split the American and British armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. For American soldiers on the ground, it was a nightmare of frozen forests, desperate retreats, and the constant rumble of approaching tanks. 2 days after the offensive began, American commanders made a fateful decision. The embargo on land-based proximity-fused shells was lifted. For the first time, American artillery would be able to use the devastating weapon against German ground forces. The shells had been specially calibrated to detonate 30 to 50 feet above the ground, showering everything below with a lethal cone of shrapnel. Unlike conventional artillery, which needed to score a direct hit or land close enough to be effective, proximity-fused shells turned the very air into a weapon. Foxholes provided no protection. Log-reinforced bunkers could be penetrated. Soldiers could not hear the incoming shells until they exploded overhead, denying them even the slim chance of taking cover. The effect on German forces was immediate and catastrophic. A chief ordnance officer in the European Theater of Operations reported on 1 German patrol caught in the Hurtgen forest by a massed artillery barrage. The 96 bodies looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder. Prisoner interviews revealed soldiers emerging from the bombardments in a dazed state, unable to comprehend what had happened. They knew they were facing something new, something terrible. They did not know what it was or how to defend against it. For German armored units, the proximity fuse created a particularly deadly problem. The tops of tanks, where armor was thinnest, were suddenly vulnerable to overhead explosions. Panzer commanders who had grown accustomed to the relative safety of their vehicles found their machines penetrated by shrapnel raining down from above. Infantry accompanying armored thrusts, essential for protecting tanks from enemy anti-tank teams, were devastated by barrages that seemed to explode in the sky itself. The careful coordination between German tanks and infantry, refined through years of warfare, began to break down under the relentless pressure of artillery that could not be evaded or anticipated. The combined effect of advances in fire control radar and the proximity fuse enabled American artillerymen to destroy targets they could not even see. Enemy positions on the reverse slopes of hills, traditionally safe from direct fire, could be engaged with deadly accuracy. German troops sheltering beneath the forest canopy discovered that the trees provided no protection from shells that exploded above the treetops. Night operations, which had previously offered some respite from artillery observation, became equally dangerous as radar-directed fire could be delivered with the same precision after dark. The battlefield had fundamentally changed. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, never a man given to understating his own achievements, made an exception when writing to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., the Chief of Army Ordnance. "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us," Patton remarked. "I am glad that you all thought of it first." Coming from a commander who prided himself on the aggressive employment of armor and infantry, this attribution of victory to an artillery innovation was remarkable. But Patton understood what the proximity fuse had accomplished. In those desperate weeks of December 1944 and January 1945, American artillery had broken the back of the German offensive not through volume of fire alone, but through a technological edge that the enemy could neither match nor comprehend. The proximity fuse was not the only secret weapon that devastated German armor in the final year of the war. Another innovation, less technologically sophisticated but equally terrifying, emerged from American efforts to provide tank crews with overwhelming close-range firepower. This was the rocket launcher T-34, better known by its nickname, the Calliope. The concept behind the Calliope was simpler than the proximity fuse, but no less deadly. Mount a multiple rocket launcher on top of an M4 Sherman tank, and you transform a vehicle designed for direct fire into a platform capable of saturating an entire area with high explosives in seconds. The standard Sherman carried a 75mm gun that fired one round at a time, requiring manual loading between shots. The Calliope could launch 60 rockets in a devastating barrage, each one carrying a high-explosive warhead equivalent to a 105mm howitzer shell. The launcher was mounted approximately 1 meter above the Sherman's turret, supported by large beams bolted to the turret cheeks. An arm connected the rocket rack to the tank's main gun, allowing the rockets to follow the same elevation and depression arc as the cannon itself. The assembly weighed 835 kilograms and consisted of 60 plastic tubes arranged in 3 banks. An upper bank of 36 tubes sat above 2 side banks of 12 tubes each. The rockets were fired electrically from inside the tank via cables running through the commander's hatch. The weapon fired the M8 rocket, a 4.5-inch fin-stabilized projectile with a maximum range of approximately 4,200 yards. Individual M8 rockets were notoriously inaccurate, prone to wobbling in flight, and deviating from their intended trajectory. But accuracy was not the point. The Calliope was designed as a saturation weapon, intended to blanket a target area with explosives rather than strike specific points. 60 rockets screaming through the air, trailing fire and smoke, descending on a position in a matter of seconds, created effects that went far beyond simple damage calculations. The name itself spoke to the weapon's character. A calliope is a steam organ, a musical instrument that produces sound by sending steam through a bank of whistles. The Calliope rocket launcher earned its name from the deafening shriek that erupted when the rockets were fired, a sound that survivors described as unearthly, terrifying, impossible to forget. For German soldiers on the receiving end, the first warning was often that shrieking wail, followed almost immediately by dozens of explosions tearing through their position. There was no time to take cover. There was barely time to understand what was happening. The psychological effect of the Calliope proved as significant as its destructive capacity. Much like the Churchill and Sherman Crocodile flamethrower tanks, the mere appearance of a Calliope could induce enemy soldiers to abandon their positions and flee. The weapon exploited a fundamental truth about combat. Human beings can endure a great deal when they believe they have some chance of survival. They can hold their ground under artillery fire if foxholes provide protection. They can face tanks if they have weapons capable of destroying them. But when confronted with something that seems overwhelming, inescapable, almost supernatural in its power, even experienced soldiers can break. The Calliope provided exactly that kind of overwhelming presence. Development of the Calliope began in 1943 as the United States Ordnance Department sought ways to increase the firepower available to assault troops. The standard Sherman tank was effective in many roles, but its 75mm gun could not provide the volume of fire needed to suppress heavily fortified positions or support large infantry attacks. Rockets offered a solution, Although less accurate than conventional artillery, they could deliver massive amounts of explosive force in a very short time, saturating targets with shrapnel and high explosives. Large numbers of Calliope launchers were manufactured in preparation for the D-Day invasion. The original plan called for using them to clear beach defenses during the initial landings. However, planners eventually abandoned this idea due to concerns about the weapon's high center of gravity. The launcher assembly, mounted on top of the tank, raised the Sherman's center of mass significantly. This made the vehicles potentially unstable on landing craft and difficult to maneuver on beaches. The Calliopes were held in reserve, waiting for opportunities that seemed slow to materialize. The weapon saw limited action throughout 1944. In December of that year, 30 Sherman tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion had T-34 launchers installed to support a planned offensive by the 30th Infantry Division. The German Ardennes offensive intervened, and the launchers were discarded without a single rocket being fired. The Calliope seemed destined to become another interesting footnote in military history, a weapon developed for one purpose and never properly employed. That changed in 1945 as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself. The Calliope finally found its purpose in the final months of the war, deployed in small numbers by the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 12th, and 14th Armored Divisions, as well as several independent tank battalions. The accounts that survive from this period speak to both the weapon's effectiveness and the dangers faced by its crews. Glenn Lamb, known by his nickname Cowboy, commanded an M4A3 Sherman named Coming Home in the 1st Platoon of C Company, 714th Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. His tank's main gun bore the word Persuader painted on its barrel. Lamb's unit operated alongside Calliope-equipped Shermans, and he witnessed firsthand both the devastation they could inflict and the price their crews paid. The rocket-equipped tanks were prized targets for the Germans, so they stayed at the back of the pack, Lamb later recalled. One of my best friends was the driver of this tank. One day, the tank and all the other standard Shermans went down a road unscathed, but the Germans had just been waiting. When the Calliope came along, the Germans opened up on it with a 20mm anti-aircraft gun, and my friend had his head blown off. The Germans understood that the rocket-launching Shermans represented a disproportionate threat. A column of standard tanks could be engaged one vehicle at a time. A Calliope could devastate an entire defensive position in a single barrage. Enemy commanders ordered their men to identify and prioritize these vehicles, waiting in ambush for the distinctive silhouette of a Sherman with its towering rocket rack. The crews operating Calliopes knew they were marked men, driving targets that drew enemy fire like magnets. They did it anyway. The M8 rockets fired by the Calliope carried warheads containing approximately 5 pounds of high explosive each. While this was less than half the explosive content of the heavier 5-inch HVAR rockets used by American aircraft, the ability to deliver 60 such warheads in a matter of seconds created devastating effects against both personnel and lightly armored vehicles. The rockets could penetrate approximately 1 inch of Class A armor, insufficient to defeat the frontal armor of most German tanks, but more than enough to damage half-tracks, armored cars, trucks, and the thinner side and rear armor of some vehicles. Against infantry positions, the Calliope was murderous. Each rocket explosion sent fragments scything through the air, multiplied by the sheer number of simultaneous impacts. Soldiers caught in the open had virtually no chance. Those in foxholes fared only slightly better as the overhead explosions rained shrapnel down into their positions. Fortified buildings offered some protection, but the volume of fire meant that even hardened structures suffered multiple hits, with catastrophic cumulative effects. The weapon proved particularly effective in urban combat, where its ability to saturate a target area with explosives could suppress multiple defensive positions simultaneously. A single Calliope engaging a building could fire enough rockets to cover every window, every doorway, every potential firing position. The defenders faced a simple choice: abandon their positions or be torn apart. Many chose to run. Many more did not get the choice. Beyond its material effects, the Calliope represented something larger about American industrial and military power. The United States had entered the war with an army smaller than that of Portugal. By 1945, it could field not only millions of soldiers and tens of thousands of tanks, but also exotic weapons systems developed specifically for particular tactical problems. The Germans had their wonder weapons, the jet aircraft and rocket missiles that Hitler believed would turn the tide. The Americans had a more practical approach: identify a problem, develop a solution, produce it by the thousands, deploy it to the men who needed it. The T-34 launcher underwent several modifications during its service life. The T-34E1 variant replaced the plastic tubes with more durable magnesium ones and incorporated improvements to allow the main gun to fire with the launcher still attached. Earlier versions had required the crew to choose between using the rockets and using the cannon. The E2 version added an improved firing system. Later developments included the T-72 launcher, designed for the newer M16 spin-stabilized rocket, which offered improved accuracy through a different stabilization method. Even more powerful was the T-40 launcher, later designated M17 and nicknamed Whiz-Bang, which fired 7.2-inch demolition rockets and saw limited service in the French and Italian campaigns. If you are finding this deep dive into forgotten weapons of the Second World War valuable, please take a moment to subscribe and share this video with others who appreciate military history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to light. The two weapons we have examined, the proximity fuse and the Calliope rocket launcher, represented different approaches to the same problem. How do you destroy an enemy who has dug in, who has armored vehicles, who has learned through bitter experience how to survive conventional attacks? The proximity fuse offered precision without direct hits. The Calliope offered volume without precision. Both were devastating. Both fundamentally changed the calculus of combat for those who faced them. The German experience in the final months of the war reflected the cumulative impact of these and other American innovations. Soldiers who had once advanced with confidence in their superior tanks and tactics found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to have unlimited resources and unexplainable weapons. Artillery that exploded in the air without warning, tanks that could launch dozens of rockets in seconds, aircraft that could locate targets through clouds and darkness, bombers that could obliterate entire cities in a single night. The technological balance had shifted decisively, and German commanders knew it. Interviews with prisoners of war during this period revealed the psychological toll these weapons exacted. German soldiers described feeling helpless against American artillery, unable to find any position safe from shells that seemed to know where they were hiding. They spoke of the terror induced by rocket attacks, the way the shrieking projectiles seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Officers reported growing difficulty maintaining discipline among troops who believed they were facing weapons against which no defense was possible. The morale impact may have been as significant as the physical casualties. The Battle of the Bulge illustrated this dynamic clearly. The German offensive began with tremendous initial success, punching through American lines and threatening to achieve strategic objectives that could have prolonged the war by months or years. The ultimate failure of the offensive resulted from many factors: determined American resistance at key points, Allied air power once the weather cleared, logistical problems that left German tanks without fuel. But American artillery, newly equipped with proximity fuses, played a crucial role in breaking the offensive momentum. German infantry that might have exploited breakthroughs created by their tanks instead died in droves under air-bursting shells they could not see coming and could not escape. The careful coordination between armor and infantry that characterized German combined arms doctrine broke down under the relentless pressure of artillery that could kill men in the open, regardless of terrain or cover. The proximity fuse achieved what years of artillery development had failed to accomplish. It made defensive fire against aircraft genuinely effective rather than merely hopeful. It enabled offensive bombardment to inflict casualties on entrenched enemies at rates previously impossible. It created uncertainty and fear among troops who could not understand why their traditional defenses no longer protected them. And it remained secret throughout the war, denying the enemy the ability to develop countermeasures or copy the technology for their own use. The aftermath of the Antwerp-Fives 1 campaign demonstrated what the proximity fuse could accomplish under optimal conditions. German commanders had adjusted their flying bombs to approach at extremely low altitudes, around 1,200 feet, making interception by conventional means nearly impossible. Section T engineers responded by designing modified fuses specifically calibrated for this challenge. The fuses were rushed into production at the Crosley factory in Cincinnati, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorized special flights of Lancaster bombers to transport them directly to Antwerp. When the modified ammunition reached the anti-aircraft batteries defending the vital port, 48 of the first 75 V-1s engaged were destroyed. The supply port remained operational throughout the war, sustaining the Allied advance into Germany. The technical achievement represented by the proximity fuse cannot be overstated. In an era before transistors, before integrated circuits, before any of the miniaturization technologies we take for granted today, American scientists and engineers created a device containing a complete radar system small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. They developed vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a cannon. They invented batteries that activated themselves at the moment of firing. They solved manufacturing problems that allowed production to scale from hundreds per day to tens of thousands per day without sacrificing quality. And they did it all under the pressure of a global war, knowing that delay meant defeat and failure meant death. Merle Tuve's leadership of Section T exemplified the best qualities of wartime scientific mobilization. He refused to accept that a problem was impossible simply because others had failed to solve it. He prioritized practical results over theoretical elegance. He drove his team relentlessly but fairly, demanding excellence while providing the resources and support necessary to achieve it. The culture he created at the Applied Physics Laboratory became a model for subsequent defense research organizations, demonstrating that academic scientists could work effectively on military problems without sacrificing their intellectual integrity. The industrial mobilization required for proximity fuse production demonstrated American manufacturing capabilities at their peak. By war's end, over 100 factories across the nation were contributing components or assembling complete fuses. Crosley, RCA, General Electric, Eastman Kodak, Sylvania, and dozens of other companies learned to produce precision electronic devices to tolerances they had never before attempted. Quality control systems developed for fuse production would later influence American manufacturing practices across multiple industries. The billion-dollar cost of the program, equivalent to approximately $15 billion today, represented one of the largest single investments in weapons technology during the war. The legacy of these weapons extended far beyond the Second World War itself. The proximity fuse established principles that would guide the development of smart munitions for decades to come. The concept of a projectile that could sense its target and optimize its detonation became the foundation for a vast family of precision weapons. The organizational model pioneered by Section T and the Applied Physics Laboratory influenced the structure of defense research throughout the Cold War. The manufacturing techniques developed for fuse production contributed to the broader evolution of American electronics industry. The Calliope represented a different kind of innovation, less technologically sophisticated, but equally significant in its tactical implications. The idea of mounting a multiple rocket launcher on a tank chassis would be developed further in subsequent conflicts. The Soviet Union had pioneered truck-mounted rocket artillery with the legendary Katyusha systems. The American adaptation of this concept to tank chassis offered improved protection for crews and better tactical mobility. Post-war rocket artillery systems drew on lessons learned from Calliope operations, even as the specific design was superseded by more advanced weapons. Both weapons shared a common characteristic that distinguished them from many other military innovations. They worked. They could be produced in large numbers. They could be deployed by ordinary soldiers without specialized training. They made a measurable difference in combat outcomes. In the history of military technology, these qualities are rarer than one might expect. Many weapons that seemed promising in theory failed in practice. Many that worked in testing proved impossible to manufacture at scale. Many that could be produced proved too complex for effective battlefield use. The proximity fuse and the Calliope succeeded on all these dimensions, which explains why they had the impact they did. The human cost of these weapons deserves acknowledgement. German soldiers who died under proximity-fused artillery barrages or Calliope rocket attacks were human beings, many of them conscripts fighting for a cause they did not choose. The devastating effectiveness of American weapons shortened the war and undoubtedly saved Allied lives, but it did so by ending German lives in numbers that remain difficult to comprehend. The men who developed these weapons, who manufactured them, who deployed them, faced moral questions that technology could not answer. The devastation they created was intentional, designed, engineered for maximum lethality. That this destruction served the cause of defeating Nazi Germany does not erase the weight of the dead. For the American soldiers who witnessed these weapons in action, the experience left lasting impressions. Artillerymen who had grown accustomed to the uncertain effects of conventional fire suddenly found themselves inflicting casualties they could measure and observe. Tank crews operating alongside Calliopes watched rockets streak toward enemy positions and saw those positions erupt in cascades of flame and smoke. The efficiency of industrial warfare, the ability to apply overwhelming force against specific targets, became viscerally real. Some found satisfaction in the knowledge that they were saving American lives. Others carried more complicated feelings about what they had seen and done. The story of the secret rocket shell that erased Panzer columns in minutes is really two stories intertwined. It is the story of the proximity fuse, a triumph of American science and engineering that transformed artillery from a weapon of chance into a weapon of certainty. And it is the story of the Calliope, a brute force solution to the problem of overwhelming close-range firepower. Both weapons emerged from the same recognition that the Second World War would be won not only by courage and sacrifice, but by technological superiority. Both demonstrated that American industry could develop and produce advanced weapons faster and in greater quantities than any adversary. Both contributed to the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany and the end of the war in Europe. The German soldiers who faced these weapons in the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945 never fully understood what had changed. They knew American artillery had become deadlier. They knew certain American tanks could unleash devastating barrages. They did not know about the tiny radar sets inside artillery shells or the physics of shape-charge warheads. They only knew that the battlefield had become more lethal than ever before, and that the weapons arrayed against them seemed to grow more powerful with each passing month. Their confusion was intentional. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse represented one of the most successful information security operations of the war. The Germans died not knowing what killed them. Lieutenant General George Patton's assessment that the proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge may have been somewhat exaggerated, as Patton's assessments often were. Many factors contributed to the American victory in that desperate struggle. But his essential point was correct. The proximity fuse represented a decisive advantage that the Germans could not match, could not understand, and could not counter. In a war increasingly defined by industrial and technological competition, it was exactly the kind of edge that determined outcomes. The Germans had gambled that one final offensive could change the course of the war. American technology ensured that the gamble failed. The men of Section T, the factory workers who assembled millions of fuses, the scientists who solved problems others had deemed impossible, they earned their place in the history of the Second World War as surely as any combat soldier. They fought with slide rules and oscilloscopes rather than rifles and grenades. Their victories came in laboratories and production lines rather than on battlefields. But the soldiers who survived because enemy aircraft fell from the sky, because artillery could destroy entrenched positions, because rocket barrages broke enemy concentrations, they owed their lives to those who had made these weapons possible. The connection between home front and front line has rarely been more direct or more consequential. The secret rocket shell that erased Panzer columns in minutes was not a single weapon, but a category of innovation, a demonstration of what could be accomplished when scientific talent, industrial capacity, and military necessity aligned in pursuit of a common goal. It represents a chapter of Second World War history that remained classified for years. After the conflict ended, its full significance only gradually revealed as documents were declassified and participants told their stories. Today, the proximity fuse is recognized as one of the three most significant technological developments of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. The Calliope, while less celebrated, deserves recognition as an effective solution to a real tactical problem, a weapon that saved American lives and hastened the end of the war. We have reached the end of today's exploration, but the history of the Second World War contains countless more stories of innovation, courage, and sacrifice waiting to be told. If you found this video valuable, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What other forgotten weapons or secret technologies would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps us understand what stories resonate most and guides our future research. Until next time, remember that the weapons that change history are not always the most famous ones. Sometimes the most decisive advantages come from innovations that remain secret until long after the fighting has stopped.